when it comes to decolonization in the 20th century, and for the most part, intense decolonization efforts are going to come to fruition following World War II. But our first example will be the Indian subcontinent. As the 20th century dawned, the Indian population grew despite 2 million deaths from famine when the monsoon rains failed from 1896 to 1900. The population went from 250 million in 1900 to 319 million just 2 decades later. And 2 decades after that, the population was nearly 390 million. This rapid growth caused landless young men to converge on the urban centers of India, and the number of unemployed exceeded the number of jobs available for them in India's young industries. During British industrialization efforts in the 19th century, which included producing timber for construction and railroad ties and clearing land for rubber plantations, loggers cut down most of the tropical hardwoods in the nation. Deforestation and excessive irrigation technically made more land available, but the amount that peasant families could own shrank with each generation. The so-called moral and material progress of India just isn't really going to benefit the average Indian. So when you look at social class, the caste system derives from its Hindu roots. Peasants made up the majority of Indian society, and they paid rent to the landlord. They also paid interest to the local moneylender and taxes to the government, so there wasn't much left over to improve their own lives. Maharajas or ruling princes owned huge chunks of land and were protected by the government. Cities were crowded with poor laborers, and the lives of women remained pretty much the same as under British rule. Dozens of languages were spoken, such as Hindi in the north, Bengali in the east, and Urdu in the northwest. English became the common form of communication between the Western-educated middle classes, similar to the role Latin played in medieval Europe. These professionals, bureaucrats, and merchants would play a large role in the independence movement. And as you can see from religion, most Indians practiced Hindu and were subdivided into the hundreds of different castes, because the pyramid you see here is a vast oversimplification. There's hundreds of these, and most had a specific occupation attached to it. Intermarriage was discouraged, and social interaction with non-Muslims was also discouraged. 25% of all Indians were Muslim, but they made up the majority of eastern Bengal and the northwest. Northern and central India had been dominated by the Muslim Mughals until the 18th century, where they're more reluctant than Hindus to learn English, and they felt discriminated against by both Hindu and the English that are present in India. So that's what we're looking at contextually in the early 20th century. Now recall that the Hindu-speaking Indian National Congress formed in 1885 to protest what they perceived to be inequalities in society, much of which derived from the fact that Indians were excluded from serving in the Indian civil service. The members of the civil service were drawn from the English gentry and made it one of the most efficient bureaucracies of all time. But the system was stacked against native Indians. In actuality, the Congress itself had very little influence outside of educated intellectual circles. They had wanted to work within the confines of British rule, and were hopeful that the sacrifices made during World War I would be rewarded with political reform. They also dealt with the division of Bengal into 2 regions, and millions of Hindu Bengalis found themselves outnumbered by Muslims in East Bengal, leading to demonstrations and boycotts of British goods. Muslims were continually fearful of Hindu dominance in other areas of India, so the All India Muslim League was formed. The government responded to this by granting a limited form of franchise that was based on wealth, but this did not benefit Muslims, who tended to be poorer than Hindus. Many were converts who were attracted by the prospect of escaping the social restrictions of Hinduism, and the British leveraged these divisions to institute separate representation and voting qualifications based on religion. Now, you couple that with the transfer of the capital from Calcutta to Delhi, the capital of the Mughal emperors in 1911, and politics really becomes a fractured movement between Hindus and Muslims. The British traditionally resisted the idea of outright industrializing, so the only Indian member of the Indian Geological Service actually joined forces with a Bombay textile magnate to open India's first steel mill in 1911. This mill really became a source of national pride for Indians and a symbol of why Indians should take charge of their own affairs. Further protests turned deadly in 1919 when 10,000 peaceful demonstrators had gathered in a garden area for a religious ceremony, unaware that the British had banned meetings in public places. They were fired upon by Indian soldiers under British command, leaving about 400 dead and 1,200 injured. And the fact that the British took 6 months to launch an investigation into these actions simply confirmed the contempt that many held for the British. Now, within India's struggle for independence and decolonization, Mohandas Gandhi stands out because he not only took the lead in advocating for Indian independence from Great Britain, but also his actions became the basis on which nonviolent demonstrations of the 20th century were based. Now, he was certainly born into a privileged life. His parents could afford to send him to England for a college education. And he lived in South Africa for a time as a lawyer advocating for the sizable Indian community in that country. Gandhi eventually returned to his native India, and like many Hindu intellectuals, he joined the Indian National Congress. Now, unlike many radical thinkers of the time, Gandhi more or less denounced ideas of power and combat. He combined the Western ideas of equality in advocating for the full rights and recognition of untouchables, and South Asian ideas of ahimsa, or non-violence. Ahimsa is how it's pronounced. He took the idea of the soul force and applied it to politics. His argument was that it was foolish to fight violence with violence, no matter how just the cause was. His arguments earned him the nickname of Mahatma, or the Great Soul, and by the early 1920s, he gave up his Western dress and decided to wear simple peasant garb. He had even attracted large numbers of followers among the poor and illiterate, and almost single-handedly transformed the cause of Indian independence from an elite intellectual movement into a mass nationalist movement. Gandhi was thrown in jail along with other leaders of the Congress in 1920, and violence accompanied the first movements of civil disobedience. Gandhi retreated to his rural home because he believed the Indian people were not ready for nonviolent protest. This allowed a new generation of leaders to emerge in the Indian National Congress, like the English-educated Nehru. When Gandhi reemerged in 1929, he led an 80-mile walk to the beach and gathered salt in defiance of a British law that stated that the Indians were not allowed to make their own salt. Gandhi discovered that he could facilitate a mass movement, but he couldn't control the direction that it subsequently took. Demonstrations broke out across India following the march and arrest of congressional leaders, leading to 100 dead and 60,000 arrested. And throughout the 1930s, Gandhi threatened to fast unto death to protest the violence of police and his followers. And he spent a total of 6 years in jail. Gandhi's legend grew with each day in prison, and he became revered by the Western media for his methods of nonviolent, peaceful protest.